Long before he was a two-term president of the United States, Barack Obama was a young man with a keen intellect and even keener ambitions. Many tomes, his own memoir included, have attempted to lay out his remarkable trajectory, none more exhaustively than that of our next guest. David J. Garrow is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and historian. His new biography is Rising Star: The Making of Barack Obama, and he joins us now for the first of two feature interviews. Tonight, the formative years, and it is so great to meet you. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you so much.
Guess what I did on my summer vacation this year? That is some tome. Let's just set the scene here. 90% of this book is essentially birth to becoming president, so we want to talk about that part of his life. And let's start with, obviously, one of the most significant influences on his life, and that was, quote unquote, "I don't want to be the kind of father I had." So said Barack Obama. So let's find out more about Barack Hussein Obama I. What kind of a man was he?
A brilliant man with a superb voice, even a far better voice than his son. But someone who developed a serious alcohol problem, was a serial womanizer, and often a violent man in his behavior towards women.
Okay, so that violence manifested itself in his attitude towards women.
Yes, especially later in his life, in his marriage subsequent to Barack's mother. Obama Sr. left his first wife and two children in Kenya to attend university in the United States. He chose Hawaii because he'd read a pictorial essay in a magazine about how there was less racial discrimination in Hawaii, such a multi-ethnic society, than elsewhere in the United States. He was the first African student to show up at the University of Hawaii. He made a huge impression on people there. But within 8 or 10 weeks of meeting Ann Dunham, who was a 19-year-old white girl who had grown up in Kansas and Washington State.
And Barack's mother.
And Barack's mother. Within 8 to 10 weeks of when Obama Sr. and Ann Dunham met, she was pregnant. They then got married. The marriage is not officially documented, but it appears to have happened. And within a year of Barack's birth, August of 1961, Obama Sr. finishes his undergraduate education and leaves for Harvard, leaving behind his son and second wife.
Which begins to explain why the son knew so little about his father, and I don't think met him till he was 10 years old or something like that.
Exactly.
The father, just a bit more on the father here. The father, you say he was brilliant, but he never really was able to achieve the destiny that he thought he was entitled to. Why did things go wrong for him?
Exactly. He begins graduate school in economics at Harvard in 1962. He's not quite the star at Harvard that he had been in Honolulu. And he also encounters a fair amount of explicit racism on the part of Harvard administrators who are upset that a black foreign student is sleeping his way around town. And so there's a pretty well-documented conspiracy, and that's not a bad word to use in this instance, among Harvard administrators to get rid of this profligate African. And so Obama is forced to return to Kenya in 1965 without having completed his PhD. And that's a matter of shame to him in subsequent years. He sometimes would pretend to have actually earned a doctorate when he didn't. But his return to Kenya is followed by a series of sour experiences, both in relationships and with his African children, and with employment situations.
Even professionally, he thought he was going to be a superstar sort of in government, and it never really worked out for him, right?
Right.
What was his ultimate demise? And by that I mean, how did he die?
He dies in a drunken car crash 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning.
What a waste.
His alcohol problem by that time was extremely serious. He'd killed someone in one traffic accident, mangled his leg in another. Even by 1971, when 10-year-old Barack met him for the first time for several weeks, he was already a shell of who he had been 10 years earlier.
How does Barack Obama, who became president, depict his father in the very famous book that he wrote, Dreams from My Father? This is now, we're going back 20 plus years when that book was published. How's the father portrayed in that book?
Barack in Dreams from My Father doesn't face up at all totally with just how sad a life his father had. There was a very good book done some years ago now, Sally Jacobs, a former reporter at the Boston Globe, a biography of Barack Sr. And she got Barack's third wife, a white New Englander who followed him to Kenya after meeting him at Harvard. She spoke very frankly to Sally Jacobs about how much physical violence she faced at Obama Sr.'s hands. One of her children, a brother, half-brother to Barack, also very painfully remembers how much violence in the home there was in his childhood. So it's a very sad, tragic story.
And therefore, as a kind of motivating feature of the son's life, this intense need not to be like my dad was omnipresent, presumably.
I believe so,
Yeah.
Particularly with avoiding alcohol abuse.
Mm-hmm. His mother, interestingly enough, is also kind of absent in that book.
Yes.
Why do you think that is?
Barack actually was 95% raised by his white maternal grandparents, his mother's parents, Stan and Madeline Dunham. Anne was a sort of peripatetic graduate student there in Hawaii. She became involved with an Indonesian graduate student, got married. They moved to Jakarta. Barack spent, 2.5 years attending elementary school in Jakarta, Indonesia. But Anne continued to do work in Indonesia and in Pakistan. And so Barack, from 5th grade on, spent 8 years in prep school in Honolulu, living with his grandparents in a very modest, almost humble, small apartment in a 12-story building, and saw his mother occasionally. But it's Stan and Madeline Dunham who raised Barry Obama, as he called himself.
As he was then known. Well, this is, if you don't mind my saying, this was, to me, one of the great insights that I took from your book, and that was that I think most people know the story of Barack Obama's dad, the fact he wasn't a feature in his life at all, the fact he turned out to be a disaster. The notion, though, of having been abandoned by his mother as well,
yes,
is new and presumably you think huge in his development as a person.
Yes.
Tell us about how those notions of trying to overcome abandonment made Barack Obama the president who he became.
Barack is a very self-formed person, but all throughout high school and his first years of college, he was a somewhat lost young man, doing a fair amount of drugs, more drugs than he himself has previously led on to.
What do they call themselves, that group?
The Choom Gang.
Choom Gang.
That's for marijuana.
Yeah.
By the time he's in New York, when he's finishing college and right after college, it's cocaine that's the issue. But it's important to emphasize that the elite prep school education that Barack had from 5th grade through 12th grade in U.S. schooling was really first rate, the Punahou School. In Hawaii. He got into it because his dad worked with a son of an important graduate. And it was really almost a college-level education during the high school years. So that even though Barack was not a star student by any stretch, he was given a really first-rate educational foundation that doesn't really emerge or flourish until when he gets to law school years later.
The other great insight I think that I took from your book was the fact that, I mean, to my eyes, and to I think 90% of North Americans' eyes, Barack Obama is an African-American. And yet, you basically describe a life in which he is a Hawaiian, an Asian, and really doesn't get in touch with his African-Americanness until he goes to Chicago, which, of course, is much later in his life.
Yes.
Where did the notion that he really wasn't in touch with his own African-Americanness come to you? How did that come to you?
Barack really has no exposure to Black Americans until really when he's age 24 and moves to Chicago for the first time. His grandfather made a big effort to introduce him to the one Black friend whom the grandfather had in Hawaii, a once very well-known African-American poet, Frank Marshall Davis. But in prep school, there were only 2 other Black students in a large student body. Barack's whole friendship network, both during high school and in his collegiate years, was these multi-ethnic, oftentimes international students. From his first semester at Occidental College in Los Angeles, he becomes best friends with a network of Pakistani guys who'd grown up in the Gulf states, London, came from very moneyed families. And so Barack's whole friendship network up through the age of 24 is most often children of the world.
He's African-American, but he has no African-American influences.
Exactly.
Let's talk for a moment here about the second paternal influence in his life, his birth father obviously having next to no influence on him, but the Indonesian second husband of his mother, Anne. What impact did he have on Barack Obama's life?
Lolo Soetoro. Barack lived with Lolo for, in essence, 3.5, 4 years. Lolo was someone who was very westernized, worked for oil companies. His marriage to Barack's mother, Anne, likewise didn't go well. They came apart after several years because Anne actually wanted someone who was more Indonesian and less westernized than Lolo was becoming. But Lolo preached sort of masculine toughness to Barack, and clearly had some formative influences. But Stan Dunham, Barack's grandfather, who was a very social, friendly, life of the party, exceptionally outgoing person. Stanley was never particularly successful in a professional working world. I mean, he was a furniture salesman, became an insurance agent. Stanley was a very warm, loving person. He's not treated well or portrayed well in Barack's own book. And people in Honolulu who knew Stanley well are still angry at how dismissively, critically Barack portrayed his grandfather.
Because he was the closest thing to a dad Barack had.
Exactly, yes.
You did mention Frank Marshall Davis, that communist poet, friend
Right.
of the family back in Hawaii, and I do want to understand as well what role you think he played in Obama's life ultimately.
Frank Davis was even older than Barack's grandfather, but Frank was the first Black adult male Barack ever was exposed to. Frank lived in a sort of rundown hippie section of Honolulu, drank a fair amount, but was seriously interested in poetry. And even in high school, Barack starts writing poetry. He tries to take it somewhat more seriously in college. And so I think the real influence that Frank Davis had on Barack was that writing was an important and potentially interesting endeavor for someone to pursue.
He was sure right about that, wasn't he?
Yes.
I mean, given how prolific Obama turned out to be. Again, 2 different sort of schools of thought here, and I'd like you to weigh in on this. The memoir that Obama penned himself describes a kind of a teenager struggling with racial identity, dealing with racism. That portrayal was not necessarily recognizable to some who also saw a much angrier Barack Obama. Where do you think the truth is in all of this?
I was struck again and again and again with all the people I interviewed from Barack's high school and college years that literally to a person, they all reject the self-portrayal that Barack in 1995, 25 years later, offered of his own young life. whether it's friends, high school teachers, the dean of students at the prep school, without exception, every single person remembers Barry Obama as this happy, smiling polite, no hostility, no anger. Barack at one point in Dreams from My Father calls himself a thug, which is just laughably incorrect. And portrays himself as you know, drinking a six-pack of beer during the school day. No one remembers Barack in that way. And so it's my judgment as a historian that Dreams from My Father, written at a time when Barack knew he was going to pursue a political career, was very calculatingly formed to give Barack a more black life in his early years than was anywhere truthfully close to being the case.
More on that in a bit. I do want to play some, let's play some tape here. This is the 34-year-old Barack Obama. He is reading an excerpt of Dreams from My Father. And here's the setup. You know, his grandmother, you referenced this in the book, his grandmother, he called her Toot.
Yes.
That was her nickname. And Toot wants her husband to drive her to work, even though she normally takes the bus every day, and the husband is angry with her. And Barry, as he was then known, is trying to mediate this disagreement among his grandparents. Okay, with that in place, let's roll the clip, please.
I took Toot into the other room and asked her what had happened. A man asked me for money yesterday while I was waiting for the bus. That's all? Toot's lips pursed with irritation. He was very aggressive, Barry. Very aggressive. I gave him $1 and he kept asking. If the bus hadn't come, why, I think he might have hit me over the head. Gramps was rinsing his cup when I returned to the kitchen. His back was turned to me. Listen, I said, Gramps, why don't you just let me give her a ride after all? She seems pretty upset. By a panhandler? Yeah, I know, but it's probably a little scary for her seeing some man block her way. It's really no big deal. He turned around and I saw now that he was shaking. It is a big deal. It's a big deal to me. She's been bothered by men before. You know why she's so scared this time? I'll tell you why. Before you came in, she told me the fellow was black.
Barack Obama from about 20-plus years ago. Did he really think his grandmother was a racist?
Yes. Yes.
Which emerged a bit, I guess, in the course of that speech he gave about Reverend Wright.
Exactly. Oh, and people, including his sister, many people were so furious at Barack for this 2008 speech where he rather gratuitously called his grandmother a white racist as political balance for offloading the black nationalist Reverend Jeremiah Wright, his pastor in Chicago.
At what point does Barry Obama become Barack Obama?
It evolves during his years in college. Everyone in Hawaii knew him all through his early life as Barry. He starts to adopt Barack during the latter part of his college years. By the time he takes his first job after college, everyone there is introduced to him as Barack.
I mean, it suggests an enhanced understanding of his African-Americanness at that point. Is that fair to say?
Or an embrace of adulthood and no longer wanting to be a child.
Okay.
I think of it more in terms of putting childhood behind. That Barry, you know, like even if someone were called Billy as opposed to William, that there's an implication of immaturity with that sort of an abbreviated nickname. So I see it more as a grasping for adulthood than as having an expressly racial connotation.
I had to tell you, I love the way you open the book because you go on about the problems of Chicago, Illinois, and the disappearance of the manufacturing sector, particularly the steel industry there, and it goes into exhaustive detail about what's happening in Chicago. at the time, and I'm thinking to myself, where's this guy going with all this? And eventually, you tell us about an ad that gets placed, and a guy who responds to an ad, and therefore comes to Chicago to be a community organizer. So that's what gets him there. People see me, he said, as an African American, but I don't have that experience. So how does moving to Chicago bring out that African American experience for Barack Obama?
Barack graduates from Columbia, finishing his undergraduate degree, 1983, spends 2 years in New York City, 1 year as a financial journalist, can't stand it, hates it, does it for 365 days and quits. He's kicking around Manhattan, doing piecework jobs, living in a sublet room in a hovel of an apartment. This is spring 1985. You know, a step away from being homeless, literally. Is reading ads for community organizers in little foolscrap publications at the public library there in central Manhattan. And he sees an ad for a community organizing job in Chicago. Sends off his, a letter and his resume.
A city he's got no connection to.
Right. The fellow who placed the ad comes to New York to visit his family, interviews Barack, hires him, gives Barack some money to buy a car. So Barack buys a used car, puts what few worldly possessions he has in the car, and sets out on the road for the 2-day drive from New York to Chicago, summer of 1985.
You go into quite exhaustive detail. Well, you probably hear people say this to you all the time, but you do. You do go into exhaustive detail, in particular about the 3 important women who are in his life after he moves to Chicago. And I wonder what kind of portrait you think they ultimately portray of this guy in his, in his growing up years, after all. He's in his 20s now.
Barack, prior to his marriage, had 3 significant girlfriend relationships. Alex McNear, whom he'd first met at Occidental College during his freshman and sophomore years. They had a sort of episodic relationship in their early 20s. Genevieve Cook, daughter of an Australian diplomat, whom he met in New York in 1984. They had a very serious relationship for over a year. Barack asked Genevieve to accompany him to Chicago in 1985. She declined. That was the first really serious relationship. And then soon after arriving in Chicago, 8 or 9 months after getting there, one of his Pakistani friends, who's a graduate student at the University of Chicago, introduced Barack to one of his fellow graduate students, a woman who's half Dutch, half Japanese, Sheila Mayoshi Yeager. And within 3 months of meeting Sheila, Barack asks her to begin living with him. And they lived together from 1986 to 1988. And talked very seriously multiple times about getting married.
Now, this is where you really run afoul of President Obama, because he does not like the motive that you ascribe to him for why this relationship ultimately led to its demise. Want to share the reason you posit?
Sheila Yeager, who's now one of the scholarly world's top experts on Korea, interestingly enough, Sheila remembers very powerfully how much emotional turmoil and angst they had in that relationship about racial identity. And Barack, during the course of their 2 years living together, came to the decision in his own mind that he had a political destiny. And both with Sheila and with another woman to whom he was very close in his workaday world at that time, Mary Ellen Montez, Lena. To both Sheila and Lena, who never met each other, both, however, have exactly the same memories of Barack telling them in 1987, 1988, that he dreams of becoming president.
It's amazing. Right. I mean, given how we know how the story ends, it's amazing that in his mid-20s he thought he was going to be president.
Yes. But
what did that mean for Sheila, though?
In Black Chicago at that time, it was very well known, expressly clear, that someone who was black could not aspire to a political future, a serious political future, if you had a white spouse. The local state senator in Hyde Park, south side of Chicago at that time, Richard Dick Newhouse, a really talented man, more talented even than Harold Washington, the famous African-American mayor of Chicago at that time. Senator Newhouse had a white wife, and so his political ceiling never went beyond the state legislature. And so in Sheila's very powerful memory, there's this inescapable tension where Barack feels that he has this political destiny, but that destiny rules out having a white spouse.
Let's do two more things here as we come to the end of the first part of our conversation here. Sheila described Obama as being profoundly lonely and unreachable. How accurate do you think that is?
I think it's very accurate. All of the people, hundreds of people with whom I've spoken who worked with Barack, really without exception, believe that there's a part of him that's unreachable.
And do you ultimately believe that he ended that relationship because he just knew that a relationship with a white Asian woman wouldn't fly if he wanted a political career?
Yes.
You do believe that, eh?
Yes, I do.
That's harsh, man. That's a harsh thing to say.
But the evidence is inescapable and conclusive. This is someone who, from 1987 forward, was always making decisions based on a belief that he could get to the White House. He leaves Chicago, turns down a full paid scholarship to Northwestern Law School to go to Harvard, to go into debt to go to Harvard Law School, because being a graduate of Harvard Law School is a much bigger gold star than going scot-free to Northwestern University, even though it's also a top 15 school. So Harvard and the decision to leave Chicago, leave Sheila, go to law school, that's step one towards the presidency.
Let's finish up on this then. Do you have any sense of how much President Obama objects to the way you are portraying these moments of his life?
Last year, I spent 8 hours at the White House with President Obama. We didn't record these. They were, in journalistic parlance, off the record. After our first conversation and before the subsequent 6 hours, he read about 95% of this book in typescript, in manuscript, and marked it up. And we sat there and he paged through and told me what he liked and what he didn't like. So I was very clear, even before this book went into final proof, how upset he was with some of the conclusions that I came to, especially regarding his relationship with Sheila Yeager.
Did he try to talk you out of that interpretation?
Yes.
Didn't work.
I don't bully well.
Do you think the president tried to bully you out of your interpretation?
I think that President Obama has behaved in a bullying way, yes.
There is so much more to say about that, but that shall await part 2 of our conversation. David Garrow, thanks so much for getting us started here, but as I suggest, we have only begun. Rising Star, The Making of Barack Obama, David J. Garrow. That's part 1 of our conversation, and I can't wait for part 2.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.